There are things people say in rooms they think are private, words that feel safe because the right person isn't supposed to be listening. Places where people speak freely because they believe the walls are on their side. Rod Stewart said one of those things in the spring of 1969. Jeff Beck was in the room. It was April and the Jeff Beck group was unraveling. Not loudly, not with arguments or thrown guitars or ultimatums. It was quieter than that, which in some ways made it harder. The kind of dissolution that happens the way a photograph fades when you leave it in sunlight. Slowly, then all at once. And by the time you notice, it's already gone. They had recorded 2 albums together. Truth in 1968, Beck Ola in 1969. Both records had found their audience. Both had been built on the same foundation. Jeff Beck's guitar, Rod Stewart's voice, and the particular tension between those two things. A tension that could sound like electricity when it worked, and like friction when it didn't. By April of 1969, it mostly felt like friction. The session was booked at a small studio in North London, nothing glamorous. A narrow room with low ceilings, acoustic foam on the walls, and a mixing console that had seen better decades. The kind of studio where serious work happened because there was nothing else to do. Just the room and the instruments and whatever you brought in with you. A window on the far wall looked out onto a gray brick wall. Rod Stewart arrived first. He was 24 years old and he already knew, with the quiet certainty that certain people carry in their bodies before they have the evidence to back it up, that something bigger was coming for him. His voice had that quality audiences couldn't explain, but couldn't ignore. It broke in the wrong places. It softened where you expected it to push. It made people stop talking in crowded rooms, not because it was loud, but because it sounded like something that had actually lived. He sat on a high stool near the console, coffee in hand, talking to Howard, the producer, a thin man who wore the same corduroy jacket to every session. They were talking about touring schedules. What came after this record? Whether there was a market for a certain kind of song in America. Jeff Beck came in about 15 minutes later. He didn't announce himself. He set his guitar case down against the far wall, opened it slowly, and began adjusting the strings. Not tuning in the urgent, preparatory way, just touching. Running his thumb across them the way you'd run your hand along a familiar surface before you start work. Something almost private about it, like a conversation between him and the instrument that didn't need witnesses. Nobody paid much attention. Howard went over the day's schedule, 2 tracks. The arrangements would be worked out in the room, as they always were with Beck. No sheet music, no charts. Beck didn't work that way. He needed space to find things, and if you gave it to him, he usually found them. Stewart had been talking about the future, his own future, carefully the way you talk about a decision you've already made but haven't announced. He mentioned a producer he wanted to meet, a direction he'd been thinking about. Solo work, implied but not stated. Howard was listening with the careful, neutral expression of a man who'd learned which way the wind was blowing. At some point, nobody agreed afterward on exactly when it happened or why. Stewart leaned back and said it. The thing is, nobody remembers the guitar. You know that, right? They remember the song. They remember the voice. The guitar is just furniture. It's there. It holds things up, but nobody walks out of a show singing the guitar part. He wasn't being cruel. That was the complicated part. He said it the way a person states something they consider obvious. Too obvious to need softening. Howard nodded slowly, the way producers nod when they're not committing to agreement, but not arguing either. Across the room, Jeff Beck continued adjusting his strings. He didn't look up. He didn't stop what he was doing. Howard would say later that he wasn't sure Beck had heard. It was the kind of thing you say when you don't want to be part of the story that follows. Beck had heard. The room wasn't that big. What he did with it was the thing nobody could have anticipated. He didn't respond. He didn't set down the guitar. He didn't turn around, didn't offer any signal that would have changed the temperature of the room. He just kept working, slowly, methodically, like a man finishing something that had nothing to do with what had just been said. The session started 20 minutes later. The first track was a blues-based piece with a loose structure. Howard had left room for Beck to move around inside it, which was the only way to get the best out of him. He hit record. Stewart stepped to the microphone and adjusted it slightly. The drummer, a session player who'd worked with both of them before, counted in. Beck played the opening phrase. 4 notes. The drummer missed his entrance. He came back in a beat later, but he was off and everyone felt it. That involuntary stumble that happens when your body reacts before your mind has finished deciding what it's reacting to. Stewart, halfway through a breath, didn't start singing. He stood at the microphone with his hands loosely at his sides, listening. What Beck was playing wasn't fast. It wasn't designed to impress. It was doing something harder to name than that. He was finding things inside the chord progression that shouldn't have been findable. Tones that existed between the notes. Feelings that didn't have technical language attached to them. The guitar sounded like it had its own opinion, like it was finishing sentences nobody had started. Stewart's right hand, which had been resting against the mic stand, closed slowly around it. He didn't notice he was doing it. Through the glass, Howard had stopped writing in his notepad. He was watching Beck's hands the way you watch something you're trying to memorize. The drummer had stopped playing entirely, not because anyone had told him to, because stopping felt correct, like the room had reached a consensus without taking a vote. Beck played for 3 minutes, maybe a little more. Just that one phrase stretched and turned and examined from different angles until it had become something else. Something that had come out of the original notes the way smoke comes out of a fire, related but transformed. Then he stopped, set the pick down on top of the amp, looked through the glass at Howard. "You want to go from the top?" Howard pressed the intercom button. His voice was steady. "Let's take 5. Stewart stepped back from the microphone. He walked to the corner where a water jug sat on a folding table, poured himself a glass, and drank it slowly and completely. Howard came into the live room. He and Beck talked about the second track. Practical things. Tempo, the number of bars before the turn, whether to build the ending or cut it clean. Their voices were low and efficient. Stewart didn't join the conversation. He stood in his corner with his empty glass, looking at the guitar still leaning against the amp, the pick resting on top of it, the strings barely visible in the low light, still carrying a faint trace of resonance, the way a room holds the shape of a sound long after the sound is gone. Something was turning over in his head. He didn't have words for it yet. He wouldn't for a long time. The session ran 3 more hours. Both tracks came together. Beck played as he always played, finding things that hadn't been written there, leaving things other guitarists would spend years trying to reverse engineer. Stewart sang well. The recordings were good. Nobody said anything about what had happened between that first phrase and the count-in. Nobody mentioned the drummer stumbling. Nobody mentioned the 3 minutes of guitar that had made the room go quiet. Beck packed his case the way he always did, careful, methodical. He said goodbye to Howard, nodded at Stewart, walked out. The door closed. Stewart sat down on the stool by the console. He looked at the floor for a moment without speaking. "He heard me," Stewart said, not to Howard specifically, more to the room itself. Howard didn't pretend otherwise. "Yeah, he heard you." "And he didn't say anything?" "No." Stewart turned his empty glass slowly in his hands. Outside somewhere, a door opened in the building and then closed again. The tape reel stopped spinning. "I know," Stewart said finally, and left it at that. By August 1969, the Jeff Beck group had officially disbanded. Beck went his own direction. He put out records that were harder to categorize, harder to sell, easier to understand if you sat quietly and let them find you. Dense, inventive work that made other guitarists pause and reconsider things they thought they'd settled. Furniture, someone had said. It holds things up. Nobody notices it. Stewart went another way. Maggie May. Every picture tells a story. Sailing. The voice everyone remembered, exactly as he'd predicted. His instinct had been right. Commercially, statistically. People left concerts humming the melody. They remembered the singer's name. The story might have stayed in that studio in North London. One of those small, true things that happen inside recording rooms and never make their way out. Except that Stewart told it himself. In 2014, in a long interview with a British publication, the conversation turned to the early years. The musicians who had shaped him and who he hadn't, at the time, properly understood. Stewart was quiet for a moment before he started. There was a session, he said. 1969. I said nobody remembers the guitar, that the guitar was furniture. A pause. Jeff was in the room. He'd heard every word. I didn't think about it at the time, or I did, and I let it go anyway, which might be worse. The interviewer waited. He didn't say anything back. He just picked up the guitar a little later and played something that I've genuinely never been able to fully describe to another person. And I understood, right there, standing at that microphone, that I had been completely wrong. Stewart looked down at his hands. But I didn't say that. I was 24 years old. I couldn't say it then. He paused. Longer this time. What Jeff's guitar actually was, what it really was, wasn't furniture. It was the architecture. It was the thing the whole room was built around. I was standing inside it. Without him, there was no room to stand in. He said it plainly. No drama, no performance of regret. Just a man in his 60s, finally saying a true thing about himself that had taken 45 years to get to. Jeff Beck died in January 2023. Stewart's tribute was short. A photograph. A few sentences that didn't try to hold more than they could. Musicians who had worked with Beck talked about his hands, about his sense of space, about the way silence worked differently around him. Not as emptiness, but as part of what he was saying. Something that happened between the notes, not instead of them. Nobody mentioned furniture. There's a particular kind of lesson that only arrives in a small room with low ceilings and a window that looks out onto a gray brick wall. The kind that doesn't announce itself. The kind that comes disguised as 3 minutes of guitar and then waits, quietly, without impatience, without resentment, for you to finally understand what it was. Rod Stewart understood eventually. 45 years is a long time, but he got there. That's more than most people do.